You are eating corn right now. Not literally, not a cob of corn, not popcorn, not tortilla chips. But if you had a meal in the last few hours, the chances are overwhelming that corn was in it, hidden in it, in forms you would never recognize as corn. The soda you drank was sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. The bread you ate contained cornstarch. The chicken or beef you had for dinner was raised almost entirely on corn. The ketchup, the salad dressing, the mayonnaise, all contain corn derivatives. The coating on your vitamins is corn-based. The adhesive on your envelopes, the ink on the pages of your books, the fuel in your car, the biodegradable plastic in your coffee cup. The average American consumes, directly or indirectly, approximately 1,500 pounds of corn per year. Most of them have no idea. Corn is the most produced crop on Earth. More corn is grown annually than wheat, rice, soybeans, and potatoes combined. It covers more land than any other plant in the Western Hemisphere. The United States alone produces approximately 40% of the world's corn, and only about 10% of that goes to human food in recognizable form. The rest goes to animal feed, ethanol, and an almost incomprehensible array of industrial products that constitute the invisible infrastructure of modern life. It was not always this way. Corn began as a wild grass in Mexico 12,000 years ago. Its domestication is one of the most remarkable agricultural stories in human history. And the path from that wild grass to the invisible ingredient in everything you eat is a story about science, politics, corporate power, and one of the strangest and most consequential decisions any government has ever made about food. What if corn had never existed? What if the plant that became the invisible foundation of the modern food system had stayed a wild grass in a Mexican valley? The miracle grass. The origin of corn is one of the most puzzling mysteries in the history of agriculture. Most domesticated crops are recognizable relatives of their wild ancestors. Wild wheat looks like wheat. Wild tomatoes look like small tomatoes. But the wild ancestor of corn, a Mexican grass called teosinte, looks almost nothing like the plant it became. Teosinte has a thin stalk, small branches, and seed heads containing approximately 12 kernels, each enclosed in a rock-hard casing. Modern corn has a thick stalk, a single massive ear containing hundreds of kernels in no casing at all. The genetic distance between teosinte and modern corn is so dramatic that when scientists first proposed they were related in the 19th century, the idea was widely rejected as impossible. It wasn't impossible. It was the result of approximately 9,000 years of continuous selective breeding by indigenous peoples of what is now central Mexico. Somewhere in the Balsas River Valley of the Mexican state of Guerrero, between 9,000 and 12,000 years ago, people began selecting teosinte plants with slightly larger seed heads, slightly softer casings, slightly more productive yields. Generation after generation, across thousands of years, they transformed a scraggly wild grass into one of the most productive food plants on Earth. This is not a minor agricultural achievement. Scientists have called it one of the most dramatic examples of artificial selection in the history of plant domestication. The people who did it had no laboratories, no understanding of genetics, no scientific theory of heredity. They had observation, patience, and 10,000 years. And they understood something about ecology that industrial agriculture would later forget. The indigenous peoples of the Americas grew corn not alone, but in combination, the system known as the Three Sisters. Corn, beans, and squash were planted together in the same mound. The corn grew tall and provided a structure for the bean vines to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen from the air into the soil, fertilizing the corn and squash. The squash spread its broad leaves across the ground, blocking weeds and retaining moisture. Three plants mutually supporting each other, producing a nutritionally complete diet, with no synthetic fertilizer, no irrigation beyond rainfall, no monoculture vulnerability to disease. When European colonists arrived in North America, indigenous peoples shared this system with them. The Haudenosaunee taught the Pilgrims to plant corn using fish as fertilizer. Without this knowledge, the early colonists would not have survived their first winters. The Three Sisters system was one of the most sophisticated agricultural innovations in human history. European settlers largely abandoned it within a generation in favor of monoculture farming they were familiar with from home. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, corn was not simply food, it was sacred. The Maya creation myth in the Popol Vuh describes humans as literally made from corn. The gods fashioned flesh from maize dough after earlier attempts with mud and wood failed. The Aztec had multiple corn deities. The annual cycle of corn planting, growing, and harvest structured the ceremonial calendar of dozens of civilizations across 2 continents. The relationship between corn and Aztec civilization ran even deeper than religion. The Aztec calendar, one of the most sophisticated timekeeping systems in the ancient world, was organized in part around the corn cycle. The agricultural year, the ceremonial year, and the civic year were all structured around the planting, growing, and harvesting of corn. The need to track corn harvests, to record tribute payments in grain, to manage the vast grain stores of the empire. These administrative necessities were among the drivers of record-keeping systems in Mesoamerica. Corn didn't just feed Aztec civilization. It helped create the administrative infrastructure that made complex civilization possible. Columbus takes the corn. When Columbus returned from his first voyage to the Americas in 1493, he brought back many things. Among them were corn seeds. Within 50 years of Columbus's first voyage, corn was being grown in Spain, Portugal, Italy, North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, China, and sub-Saharan Africa. The speed of its spread was extraordinary, faster than any other crop transplanted from the Americas to the Old World. The reason was simple. Corn was extraordinarily productive, extraordinarily adaptable, and could be grown in climates and soils where wheat and barley failed. In southern Europe and North Africa, corn provided a calorie supplement for populations that chronically lacked them. In West Africa, it spread along trade routes, including, with brutal irony, the slave trade routes that simultaneously were transporting millions of Africans to the Americas to work on plantations. Corn fed the enslaved on the Middle Passage. Corn fed the populations whose members were being taken. Corn was on both sides of one of the greatest atrocities in human history. But Europeans who adopted corn made a catastrophic mistake that indigenous Americans never had. They adopted the grain, but not the preparation. For thousands of years, Mesoamerican peoples had processed corn using a technique called nixtamalization, soaking and cooking the kernels in an alkaline solution, typically lime water. This process, which takes hours and requires specific knowledge, transforms corn nutritionally. It releases niacin, vitamin B3, that is otherwise locked in the grain and unavailable to human digestion. It increases protein availability. It reduces mycotoxins. Nixtamalized corn is nutritionally complete. Unnixtamalized corn is not. When Europeans and North Americans began eating corn as a dietary staple without nixtamalizing it, the result was pellagra, a niacin deficiency disease characterized by the 4 Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. In the American South in the early 20th century, where poor populations subsisted heavily on corn grits and cornbread made from unnixtamalized corn, pellagra became epidemic. Between 1906 and 1940, approximately 3 million Americans suffered from it. Over 100,000 died. For decades, physicians and public health officials searched for an infectious agent, a bacterium, a virus, a parasite that might explain the disease. The idea that food itself could be the cause was resisted. Dr. Joseph Goldberger, the public health researcher who eventually proved the dietary cause of pellagra in the 1910s and 1920s, was ridiculed, obstructed, and largely ignored during his lifetime. The connection between corn, niacin, and pellagra was not officially accepted until 1937. The people who had grown corn for 9,000 years had never experienced pellagra. Because they had developed nixtamalization, Europeans took the crop and left the knowledge behind. It cost them 100,000 lives. The subsidy that changed everything. For most of human history, corn was a significant but not dominant crop. It fed people and animals. It served as a raw material for various products, but it shared the agricultural landscape with dozens of other crops. Then the United States government made a decision that changed the global food system in ways that are still playing out today. In 1973, under Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, the United States restructured its agricultural subsidy system in a way that strongly incentivized the production of a small number of commodity crops, primarily corn and soybeans. Butz told American farmers to plant corn from fence row to fence row. His famous instruction to farmers who couldn't compete with industrial-scale production was 3 words: get big or get out. In the decade following his policy changes, the number of American farms fell by nearly half. The result was an explosion in corn production. The price of corn fell, and cheap corn began to flow into every corner of the American food system, and then the global food system, looking for applications. The food industry found them. High fructose corn syrup, developed in the 1970s, replaced sugar in soft drinks and processed foods because it was cheaper. The transition happened product by product, quietly, without consumer announcement. Pepsi switched first. Then, in 1984, Coca-Cola, the company that had used the same cane sugar formula since 1886, quietly switched to high fructose corn syrup in the United States. The company never officially announced the change. Most consumers didn't notice. The Mexican version of Coca-Cola, still made with cane sugar due to different trade economics, became a cult item in American cities. People driving to Mexican neighborhoods specifically to buy the version that tasted the way Coke used to taste. A soft drink made with the original sweetener became a specialty product. The corn-sweetened version became the default. And then NAFTA opened the Mexican market to American corn. Mexico, the country that invented corn, where corn had been grown for 12,000 years, suddenly faced competition from heavily subsidized American corn that could be sold below the cost of production. An estimated 1.5 million Mexican farmers lost their livelihoods in the years following NAFTA. Many of them migrated north to the United States to find work. The country that created corn was being undercut by the country that industrialized it. You are what corn eats. There is a test that scientists can run on human tissue that tells you what you've been eating. Carbon isotope analysis measures the ratio of different carbon isotopes in your body. Different plants have different carbon isotope signatures. Corn has a distinct signature, different from wheat, rice, or most other plants. Because carbon from the food you eat is incorporated into your tissues, your body's carbon isotope ratio reflects your diet. When scientists ran this test on Americans in the 1990s and 2000s, they found something striking. The carbon isotope signatures of American bodies closely matched the carbon isotope signature of corn. Not because Americans were eating enormous amounts of corn directly, but because the animals they were eating had been raised on corn. The sweeteners they were consuming were derived from corn, and the processed foods they were eating were constructed from corn derivatives. Michael Pollan, in his book The Omnivore's Dilemma, put it simply: Americans are, from a chemical standpoint, made of corn. This concentration has consequences. The American diet, restructured around cheap corn, has produced patterns of nutrition that public health researchers have linked to the obesity epidemic, the explosion of type 2 diabetes, and the chronic diseases that now account for the majority of American healthcare costs. High fructose corn syrup has been specifically implicated in the rise of metabolic disease. The corn-fed beef that replaced grass-fed beef has a different fatty acid profile that may contribute to inflammation. And the corn that produces all of this is no longer the corn that the Maya bred. Approximately 90% of corn grown in the United States today is genetically modified. primarily varieties developed and patented by Monsanto, now owned by the German chemical company Bayer. These varieties are engineered to be herbicide-resistant, or insect-resistant, or both, and they deliver higher yields under industrial farming conditions. They cannot be saved for next season's planting. Doing so would violate the patent. Every year, farmers must purchase new seeds from the corporation that owns them. The plant that indigenous peoples bred freely over 9,000 years, improving it generation by generation, sharing seeds and knowledge across cultures and continents. That plant is now legally owned by a German chemical company. A farmer who saves corn seeds the way farmers have saved seeds for 10,000 years is now potentially liable for patent infringement. The cheapest food system in human history has also produced some of the worst health outcomes in the developed world. Corn and the planet. Growing corn at the scale that the modern global system requires has environmental consequences that dwarf almost any other agricultural practice. American corn agriculture depends on nitrogen fertilizer, produced primarily through the Haber-Bosch process, which uses natural gas to fix atmospheric nitrogen. The nitrogen that isn't absorbed by corn plants runs off into waterways, creating algal blooms that deplete oxygen and kill aquatic life. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone, an area of low oxygen water off the coast of Louisiana that kills fish and marine life, is fed primarily by nitrogen runoff from cornfields in the Mississippi River Basin. It covers approximately 6,000 square miles every summer. It has existed since the 1970s. American corn agriculture also depends on irrigation, primarily from the Ogallala Aquifer, a vast underground water reservoir beneath the Great Plains that took millions of years to accumulate. The aquifer is being depleted far faster than it is replenished by rainfall. At current rates of depletion, significant portions of it will be economically unusable within decades. The corn grown on it today is being watered by water that will not be available to the farmers of the next generation. And then there is ethanol. By 2023, approximately 40% of all American corn was being converted to fuel. The United States was burning its food supply in its cars. Consider the state of Iowa. Iowa produces more corn than any country on earth, except the United States as a whole and China. Its landscape is dominated by cornfields from horizon to horizon, and yet Iowa imports approximately 80% of its food from other states. The corn that covers Iowa is not feeding Iowa. It is feeding industrial feedlots in other states, sweetening processed food in factories elsewhere, and being burned as ethanol in cars across the country. A state that could, theoretically, grow enough food to feed itself many times over cannot feed itself, because the crop it grows is not a food system. It is an industrial input. The plant that fed civilizations for 12,000 years is now primarily used to feed industrial feedlots, sweeten processed food, and propel automobiles. Less than 10% of American corn goes directly to human food. And then there is movie theater popcorn. During the Great Depression, when cinema attendance was collapsing and theaters were struggling to survive, vendors began selling popcorn outside theater entrances. Theater owners initially resisted. They considered popcorn lowbrow, and they were afraid that the smell and the noise of eating would disturb the refined atmosphere they were trying to maintain. They relented only when they realized that popcorn vendors were making more money than the theaters themselves. They bought out the vendors, installed their own popcorn machines in the lobbies, and within a decade, popcorn had become inseparable from the cinema experience. Today, the profit margin on movie theater popcorn is estimated at approximately 1,200%. The average cinema makes more money from its concession stand than from its ticket sales. The most profitable food product in the history of American entertainment is a direct transformation of the sacred grain of the Maya, the plant their gods were made from, the currency of their empire, the center of their ceremonial calendar, sold at a markup that would have seemed insane to any human who lived before the 20th century, consumed thoughtlessly in the dark while watching a movie. Finale. A world without corn. No Aztec or Maya civilization as we know it, the cultures that created corn and were created by it, are inseparable from the plant. No Popol Vuh, no corn deities, no ceremonial calendar built around the harvest, no corn spreading through Africa and Asia after Columbus, changing the population capacity of entire continents. A different global demographic history. No high-fructose corn syrup, no corn-fed feedlot beef, no corn ethanol mandate, no Gulf of Mexico dead zone, no Ogallala aquifer crisis, no pellagra epidemic from corn eaten without the knowledge of how to prepare it. No 1.5 million Mexican farmers displaced by subsidized American corn. No German chemical company owning the patent on the world's most important grain. And possibly no obesity epidemic at the scale we have it. No type 2 diabetes crisis at the scale we have it. A different relationship between cheap food and public health. One grass from a river valley in Mexico 12,000 years ago. But here is what the history of corn actually tells us. Every food in this series has been transformed by the systems that controlled it, taken from its origins, remade in the image of profit, and embedded so deeply into daily life that its history becomes invisible. Sugar, coffee, tea, chocolate, corn. The difference with corn is that the transformation is almost total. You can still eat a cup of coffee that tastes like what people have been drinking for centuries. You can still eat a potato that resembles what sustained European populations for 200 years. But the corn system, the thing that high fructose corn syrup and corn-fed beef and corn ethanol and corn starch in everything represents, has almost no relationship to the sacred plant that the Maya made their gods from. You are eating corn right now. You just can't see it. That invisibility is the point. The most successful takeover is the one you never notice.